There's a particular kind of silence that terrifies certain people more than screaming ever could. Not the silence of an argument, not the silence of being ignored, the silence of someone who used to explain themselves, used to fight for the relationship, used to send the "can we talk" text, and simply doesn't anymore. That silence isn't absence. It's a verdict. And the people who inspire that kind of silence rarely see it coming, because they spent so long believing they held all the power that they never once considered what happens when the person they underestimated finally stops asking to be understood. This is a story about that moment, about what happens in the weeks, months, and years after an empath walks away from someone who spent the entire relationship convinced they were irreplaceable, and about the transformation that follows them afterward, whether they want it to or not. Let's start with what almost nobody tells you about narcissistic relationships. The ending isn't really an ending, not for them. It's an interruption. Somewhere inside a narcissist's psyche, relationships aren't stories that conclude. They're performances that get paused, recast, or rewritten, but never truly finished. Because finishing would require a kind of closure their fragile sense of self cannot generate on its own. So when you leave, cleanly, quietly, without the dramatic explosion they were half expecting and maybe even hoping for, you don't just exit the relationship, you break the performance. And a performance without an ending doesn't just stop, it haunts. Here's the part that will change how you understand everything that comes after. Narcissists don't process loss the way empaths do. You grieve forward, painfully, slowly but forward, toward acceptance, toward a version of yourself that integrates what happened and keeps moving. They grieve sideways. They displace it, disguise it, dress it up as anger, as indifference, as a suspiciously fast rebound relationship that looks, from a distance, like proof they never cared at all. But underneath that performance, something entirely different is happening, something they will spend years trying not to name. Because your absence doesn't just remove a person from their life, it removes a function. And this is the piece almost nobody understands about why narcissists unravel after an empath leaves. You weren't just their partner. You were their regulation system. Think about what you actually did, day after day, without ever being thanked for it. You absorbed their bad moods before anyone else had to witness them. You translated their outbursts to friends and family. They're just stressed. They didn't mean it that way. You have to understand what they've been through. You anticipated the mood shift 3 steps before it happened and adjusted the entire room around it. That wasn't love in its purest form. It was labor, invisible, relentless, unpaid emotional labor that kept their entire self-image from collapsing under its own weight. And when you left, nobody replaced that. Nobody could replace that overnight, because it took you years of quiet, exhausting practice to become fluent in a language most people never even learn exists. So here's what actually happens in real time once the door closes behind you. At first, and I want to be honest with you about this part, because it's the part that hurts the most to witness from a distance. They seem fine. Better than fine. They seem thriving. New relationship within weeks. A social media presence that looks like a highlight reel of healing, of growth, of finally finding real happiness. And if you're newly out of that relationship, still raw, still questioning whether the years you gave meant anything at all, this performance will cut you open in ways you didn't expect. It will make you wonder if you were disposable, if your absence changed nothing, if they simply moved on like you were a chapter they closed without a second thought. You need to understand what you're actually looking at, because it is not what it appears to be. What you're witnessing is not recovery, it's damage control performed at maximum speed, because slowing down means confronting a silence that is, for a narcissist, unbearable. The new relationship isn't proof of healing. It's a scramble for a replacement mirror, someone new to reflect back the version of themselves they need to keep believing in. And here is where the story takes its first real turn. The one they never saw coming. The new person doesn't know the choreography. They don't know when to go quiet during a mood they don't yet understand. They don't know which stories need embellishing and which ones need softening before repeating to other people. They haven't spent years being slowly, invisibly trained, the way you were, without ever agreeing to the training, to sense a shift in the air before a single word is spoken. That fluency took you years to build. It cannot be downloaded. It cannot be faked convincingly for long. And every time the new person fumbles a moment you would have caught instinctively, something small and cold settles into the narcissist's chest that they do not have the language for yet. It will take longer than you expect for that feeling to have a name. But it is already there, growing, in the space where you used to stand. And this is where the real transformation begins. Not a transformation they chose, not one they'll ever admit is happening, but one that unfolds regardless, in the accumulation of moments too small to name individually and too consistent to ignore collectively. The first thing that changes is the story, not the version they tell the world. That one stays polished, rehearsed, endlessly repeated until even they start to believe it. I mean the version underneath it, the one that exists only in the space between waking and sleeping, in the seconds before the phone lights up with a distraction. In that version, you slowly stop being too sensitive and start becoming something far more inconvenient to their narrative, the one person who saw everything, tolerated more than anyone should have to, and still walked away with more dignity than they've managed to summon in months. That shift is dangerous for them because their entire self-concept depends on being the exception. The one people are lucky to know, the one whose flaws are actually just misunderstood depths. A person who leaves cleanly, without begging, without a scene, without the satisfying collapse that would confirm the narrative that you couldn't handle real intimacy. That person doesn't fit the story. And a narcissist without a coherent story about themselves is a narcissist standing on ground that no longer feels solid. So the second thing that changes is far more visible and far more public. The mask starts slipping in front of an audience. It was never designed to survive without you managing it. Friends who used to hear only your side filtered through their retelling. She's just difficult. Was just intense. You'd understand if you knew him better. Start noticing things you spent years quietly absorbing before anyone else had to. An outburst that used to happen behind closed doors now happens in a restaurant, in front of people who don't have your years of practice smoothing it over before it becomes a story people tell each other later. A pattern that used to look like isolated bad luck. Her ex was toxic. His last relationship was just complicated, starts repeating with the new partner in a timeline too short to explain away. This is the part they never expected, the part your absence set into motion the moment you stopped being the buffer between who they actually are and how the world experiences them. The world starts seeing them clearly, not because you told anyone anything, not because you needed to defend yourself or explain what really happened, simply because the management system disappeared, and management systems, once removed, reveal exactly what they were holding up. Underneath all of this, underneath the new relationship moving too fast, underneath the friendships quietly fraying, underneath the careful performance for anyone still watching, a question is forming that they will spend enormous energy trying not to let fully surface. It doesn't arrive as a single dramatic epiphany. It arrives in fragments, ambushing them at the worst, most unguarded moments. It arrives in the middle of an argument with someone new that echoes, almost word for word, an argument they had with you. Except this time, there's no one there who instinctively knows how to de-escalate it. No one who spent years learning exactly which words land softest. It arrives in a car ride home from a gathering where the new partner didn't defend them the way you always did, automatically, out of a loyalty that took years to condition. It arrives on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, in a silence with nothing to distract from the fact that something essential is missing, and has been missing since the exact day you closed the door. The question, when it finally forms enough to be almost heard, sounds something like this. What if she was the only one who ever really loved me, and I'm the reason it's gone? Most narcissists will not let that question fully land. They'll bury it fast under new supply, under a new curated story where they're the misunderstood hero, and you were simply someone who couldn't handle what they had to offer. That burial is not weakness. It's self-preservation, the only kind their psychology has ever known how to perform. But burial doesn't erase a truth. It just changes its shape, and the shape it takes is rarely comfortable. It becomes insomnia at 3 in the morning, when the applause has died down, and there's no one left to perform for. It becomes a restlessness that follows them into rooms full of people telling them how wonderful they are. A hollowness no amount of external validation quite manages to fill anymore, the way it used to before you left and took your particular, hard-won fluency in loving them with you. It becomes a compulsive, low-grade anxiety every time a new partner pulls back even slightly. Because some part of them now knows, has to know, on some level too threatening to examine directly, exactly how replaceable they actually are when the person on the other end isn't willing to disappear into managing them. This is the beginning of the change your absence set in motion. Not redemption. Not necessarily growth. Growth requires a choice they may never be brave enough to make. But change, undeniably, permanently, in the architecture of who they are and how the world now sees them. A life slowly stripped of its stage management, its careful choreography, its buffer against consequence. And somewhere in that unraveling, in the sleepless nights, in the friendships quietly dissolving, in the question they cannot quite outrun no matter how fast the news story moves, something is happening to you too. Something they will never witness, because by the time it's fully formed, you'll already be too far gone from their reach to notice. You are becoming the person you were always meant to be before you learned to disappear inside someone else's need for control. It doesn't happen all at once. Healing rarely does. It happens in small, unremarkable moments that only reveal their significance in hindsight. The first morning you wake up, and your body isn't already scanning for what mood you'll need to manage before breakfast. The first time someone raises their voice near you and your nervous system doesn't brace for the version of you that used to know exactly how to make yourself smaller. The first time you say no to something and the sky doesn't fall and nobody disappears, and you realize, with something between relief and grief, that it was always safe to have limits. You just never had anyone who respected them. This is the part of the story the narcissist will never witness, because you're no longer performing it for an audience that stopped deserving one. They don't see the empath who used to apologize for taking up space, slowly learning to fill a room without flinching. They don't see the person who used to interpret every silence as a storm, learning that some silences are just peace. They don't see you rebuilding, piece by piece, a version of yourself that isn't shaped around anticipating someone else's next move. And here is the truth underneath everything we've walked through together. The one this entire story has been circling since the very first hook. Your absence didn't just change them. It had to change you first. Every time you didn't reach out during the withdrawal. Every time you resisted the old reflex to check if they were okay. Every time you chose your own peace over the familiar comfort of managing someone else's chaos. That was a decision repeated enough times that built an entirely different person than the one who walked into that relationship believing love meant sacrifice without limit. What you're left with, on the other side of all that quiet, is not the death of your empathy. That was never the danger, and it was never the flaw everyone tried to convince you it was. What you're left with is empathy with boundaries. Finally, a capacity for depth that no longer comes at the cost of your own disappearance. And that transformation, the one nobody was managing on your behalf, the one you built entirely without applause, is the thing they will never be able to reach again. Not because they're incapable of change. Some of them, eventually, do change, slowly, painfully, usually far too late to matter to you. But because the version of you that emerges from this isn't waiting to find out. Meanwhile, their story keeps circling the same broken loop. New relationships that ignite fast and burn out faster. Because the people they choose now don't carry the years of conditioning that once made you patient beyond reason. Friendships fraying under the weight of a personality that was only ever sustainable with a devoted stage manager running quiet interference behind the scenes. A private, unspoken reckoning with a mirror that no longer shows them what they need it to. Now that the one person who used to soften every reflection is gone, some of them will spend the rest of their lives in that loop, circling the question, never once landing on it long enough to actually change. That is the quiet tragedy at the center of this story. Not punishment, not karma, nothing so poetic. Just the plain, permanent consequence of losing the one person capable of loving them fully and choosing, in the end, to love herself more. If you're listening to this and you recognize every word, if you're the one who left, the one still wondering in your quieter moments whether it meant anything, whether the silence on the other end means they've forgotten you completely or means something is finally cracking open the way you always secretly hoped it would. I want you to hear this clearly. It was never your job to find out. It was never your responsibility to wait by a closed door for the sound of it finally opening. Your absence was never cruelty. It was the truest thing you ever gave them. The plain, undeniable proof that some things cannot survive on one person's love alone. Your job now isn't to track their transformation from a distance. It isn't to wonder if that caption was about you, if that new relationship is proof they've healed or proof they've simply found a new understudy for the same tired role. Your job is to keep walking toward the life you're building. The one where your voice has weight, where your empathy has limits, where your presence is a gift freely given and never again an obligation quietly extracted. Because here is the final truth this story has been building toward from the very beginning. You were never the one who needed to change. You were whole before you ever met them, and you are whole now, standing on the other side of the silence. You finally allowed yourself to keep. The only thing that ever needed to change was the belief that walking away meant losing. When the truth, the whole time, was that walking away was the moment you finally started winning back everything you'd quietly given up. They never expected your absence to change them forever. But what they really never expected, what they will spend the rest of their life circling and never quite catching, is that it finished the work of changing you into someone they can no longer reach, no longer charm, no longer convince that what they offered was ever love at all. And somewhere in the quiet that follows, long after the wreckage settles and the new stories stop working and the mirror finally stops lying to them, you'll understand the ending was never really about them. It was about you becoming someone they could never break again.